The wind dragged the light out of the sky like a thief. By the time Thomas Avery unlatched the barn door, the last breath of winter sun had already vanished behind the ridge, bleeding gold into slate. He stepped into the cold, dark stillness, expecting the quiet groan of wood and the must of hay, nothing more. But the sound that met him wasn't natural. It was breath, shallow, rattling, human. He froze. The horses shuffled in their stalls, sensing something off. Thomas slowly shifted his weight, his boots crunching the frost-crusted earth beneath. The barn straw. In the corner, half buried under a collapsed wool sack and loose hay, lay a shape, small, still, human. He crouched, and the lamp he carried caught on a dark mess of tangled hair, mud-caked skin, and the sharp angle of a cheekbone. Her leg was twisted, and around her ankle, iron, a rusted trap clung like a predator. Blood crusted down her heel into the straw. Apache, his chest tightened, not from hatred. Not even fear, just memory. So many years ago, before the war ended. Before the baby's grave, before the silence that filled every inch of his house, he'd fought men who might have known her name. Or her father's. He looked at her face again, young, maybe 19, maybe younger. Her braid was snapped midway, a rough tear like a punishment. She wasn't moving. He didn't speak. Words felt foolish. Instead, he slipped his hand under. Her shoulders and her head lolled sideways, still warm. That was reason enough. Thomas lifted her carefully, surprised by how little she weighed. She didn't stir, not even when the barn door slammed shut behind them, not even when the wind slapped at them like a wild dog. Inside the cabin, the fire was low, but still living. He laid her down on a heap of feed sacks in the corner near. The hearth infected the sharpest knife from the cupboard. The trap needed removing first. It wasn't kindness, not exactly. It was something older, quieter, a man's obligation to pain when it landed on his land. The trap snapped open. With effort. She whimpered then, soft as a broken branch underfoot. He muttered something beneath his breath. Not English, not prayer, just noise, to remind her she wasn't dead yet. He found the old kettle, filled it from the rain barrel, and hung it on the fire hook. While it heated, he cut the hem off. An old undershirt and cleaned her wound. She didn't wake. But she didn't fight either. Later, he found a quilt in the cedar chest, the blue one with faded white stitching, and laid it over her. Her breathing steadied, not safe. But steadier. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat in the chair nearest the fire. The second chair remained empty. It always did. Still, sometimes he'd glance at it, forgetting she wasn't there anymore. The rocking chair creaked slightly, nudged by wind slipping under the doorframe. Outside, snow began to fall. By dawn, she was awake. He heard the shift of breath first, then the sharp, small sound of the blanket rustling as she pulled it higher. Her eyes were open but not looking at him. Not at anything. She stared at the fire like she meant to memorize it. He crouched beside the stove, ladled stew into a bowl, and placed it on the floor near her. She didn't reach for it. "Eat if you can," he said. His voice was rough, barely above a whisper. "I'd boiled the bitterness out." She said nothing. He didn't push. Words weren't the currency needed right now. She ate when he turned away, slow and quiet. When she finished, she left the bowl exactly where he placed it. That night, she slept again near the hearth, and again the night after. By the fourth morning, she spoke. Not in English, not first. But the word she gave when he asked her name was soft, careful, like it had teeth she didn't trust to keep hidden. Neha. He nodded, tasting the syllables. Didn't try to say. It allowed, she noticed. Her shoulders relaxed a little. He didn't ask where she came from, who left her, what they meant to do when they caught her. She didn't ask why a white man with hands that still bore the grooves of rifle work would carry her out of a barn and patch her leg. They existed beside one another, not with. At least not yet. The snow deepened. The fence posts disappeared. Beneath the white, the porch creaked when the wind hit hard. But inside, the cabin held its own kind of warmth, stubborn, flickering, but alive. In the dark hours before dawn, Thomas would sit with his coffee, the second cup still poured, but untouched. Neha would sleep, fingers curled around the edge of the quilt. Occasionally she'd mutter in dreams, sometimes pain, sometimes fear. He never woke her. Some rescues come loud, on horseback in gunfire with voices raised and banners flown. Others come wrapped in blankets, silent as snow, and just as slow to melt. Asked ChatGPT. The days moved slow, as if time itself was cautious around them. Neha's wound mended in quiet stages, the swelling eased. The bruising yellowed, her limp became measured, no longer dragging. But healing, Thomas knew, wasn't just a matter of flesh closing up. It was in how she flinched at the crack of wood in the fire, or how she kept her back to the wall when she sat near the hearth. Her hands rarely stilled. She'd rub her thumbs against her knuckles or count under her breath, fingers tapping. Faint rhythms against her thigh like a code only she knew. Thomas didn't ask. He'd never been good at questions. And he'd grown tired of answers long ago. He watched from a quiet distance, sometimes from behind the rim of a coffee mug, other times while fixing a hinge or cleaning the rifle. She was always there now, not in his life, not yet, but in his space, moving through it like a shadow that hadn't yet decided to leave or stay. Once, he noticed pale patches of skin across her forearms, angry and warped, old burns, healed wrong, not fire, oil, maybe, or rope. He didn't stare, just noticed. And once, when she was bent over the hearth stirring beans, her shirt slid just enough to show a scar that curved along her shoulder blade, like a rope had found her and refused to let go. That night, he drank his coffee slower than usual. The silence between them was different now, not hostile, just worn thin. Like boots too long on the trail? They shared the space like old dogs who didn't trust each other yet, but didn't growl either. It was enough for now. One night near dusk, Thomas returned from the barn to find her sitting outside on the porch step. The wind had picked up, tugging at the hem of her skirt and lifting dust from the dry earth. In her lap she held a single feather, dark brown, slightly curved, the kind you'd find near the creek beds after spring. She ran her fingers along it again and again, whispering something in Apache. The sound of it was soft, half lost. To the wind, he didn't interrupt, just stood there, watching, then quietly turned back into the cabin and closed the door behind him. Later, he climbed to the loft, a part of the cabin he hadn't entered in over a year, and opened the cedar chest buried beneath folded quilts and tools no longer needed. The smell hit him first, lavender and cedar, faint but still clinging. Beneath a hand-stitched pillowcase, he found what he was looking for, Miriam's shawl. It was faded now, a deep dusty red with black and cream stitching along the edges. She used to wear it every night once the cold came in, folding it tight around her shoulders like armor. She'd sit in the rocking chair, humming to herself as the wind moaned across the plain. After she passed, he folded it once, then again, and placed it in the chest. Never touched it since. Now, it felt wrong to let it sleep any longer. He brought it down, folded neatly, and left it on the edge of Neha's cot without a word. In the morning, she was sitting by the fire, wrapped in it. She didn't say thank you. He didn't need her to. Some things didn't ask for gratitude. They were offered because silence needed filling, and this gesture was quieter than words. From that day on, she wore the shawl in the evenings. Sometimes when she'd braid her hair, he'd catch her rubbing the fringe between her fingers like she could feel someone else's hands in the fabric. He didn't talk about Miriam. Not aloud. But his thoughts turned toward her more often now, not in the aching way they used to, not with bitterness or the deep, dull grief that once made the cabin feel like a tomb. He remembered the night fever took her, how the town preacher had offered to bury her in the church plot, but only if Thomas paid a tithe and made a statement condemning the Apache raids. He refused. Miriam had taught him better. So they buried her near the cottonwood tree, just past the barn. The same spot he'd plant daffodils every spring, even though they rarely bloomed. That night, Thomas sat on the porch with his pipe, watching the horizon blur under moonlight. Neha emerged quietly, settled beside him on the step, not touching, not looking. But near, she wore the shawl like it had always been hers. He didn't speak, but he felt it, something shifting, not trust, Not yet, but a pause in the storm, and that was more than he'd expected to find this winter. The storm began like a whisper, wind sliding through the dry grass in slow warning, and ended in fury. By dusk, the prairie had turned to slate. Clouds rolled in heavy and sharp-edged, pushing low over the hills like cattle herded by God himself. Rain came down in blades, slicing against the roof of the cabin, drumming the boards with a force that shook the windows in their frames. Thunder cracked like splitting timber. Lightning flashed wide across the sky, painting the barn in ghost white. Every few minutes, Thomas lit the lamps early and bolted the door. Inside, Neha sat cross-legged by the hearth, her hands wrapped around a chipped tin mug of chicory. She didn't flinch at the storm, just listened to it, like it reminded her of something she couldn't say aloud. Thomas checked the rifle twice. Loaded, clean, it always was. He had just set it beside the door when he heard the sound. Not thunder, distant, then louder. Sloppy in the mud but determined. 3 horses, maybe 4, but only 3 shadows dismounted. Thomas didn't move toward the door. He just stood there, watching it like a man watching a slow flame climb a curtain. Neha didn't speak, but her eyes snapped toward the window. Her whole body went still, like a deer scenting ash. Voices, male, confident, close now. The knock wasn't a knock. It was the butt of a pistol, sharp and deliberate, against the doorframe. "Evenin'," one of them called. The voice was soaked in whiskey and smug. "Heard you might have something in your barn that don't belong to no man." Thomas didn't answer. He stepped toward the door slowly, picked up the rifle from where it leaned, and cradled it across. His arms. Another voice, younger, raspier. "We ain't here for trouble. Just a piece of what's owed. She's wanted, escaped, we got papers." A pause, "Or we could just take her off your hands quiet like." Thomas opened the door, rain blew in sideways, soaking the wooden floor instantly. The 3 men stood under their hats and slickers, faces glistening with rain and greed. One of them grinned, wide, yellow teeth and a scar that split his bottom lip. He held a rifle down at his side like it wasn't even loaded. "Just part of the performance," I said. "Right on," Thomas said. Scar lip tilted his head. "You got no cause to protect her. Apache don't bury white men. They bury knives in M." Thomas raised the rifle. The man's grin dropped. One of the others went for his weapon. The shot cracked so loud it split the rain. One of them dropped hard in the mud. The others scattered, firing blindly toward the cabin as they dove behind the water trough and fence post. Thomas stepped back into the doorway to reload, and that's when the bullet found him. It struck just above the hip. Not deep, but clean enough to stagger him backward. He collapsed onto the floor with a grunt, one hand still gripping the rifle. The other pressed to the dark bloom spreading across his shirt. Neha was there before he could speak. She knelt beside him, face pale but focused, and pressed a towel to the wound. Her hands shook for only a moment, then steadied. "Stay," she said, voice sharp. She ran to the shelf, grabbed another cloth, a half bottle of whiskey, and the small lantern. As she cleaned the wound, she whispered in Apache. The words were unfamiliar to him, like water over stone, but the cadence was prayerful, soft, like she was speaking to something older than either of them. He watched her work by the dim yellow glow, her braid falling forward, soaked at the tips from the open door. She poured the whiskey on the wound, and he gritted his teeth so hard his molars ached. She didn't flinch. Outside, the storm swallowed the sounds of retreat. Hoofs pounded away, fading into the hills. The shooters didn't come back. Inside, the air smelled of gunpowder, rain, blood, and burning oil. When she was finished, Neha sat on the floor beside him, one hand resting lightly on the edge of the blood-soaked towel. She didn't speak. Neither did he. The storm had lost its rage. It was rain now, steady and tired, like a song reaching its last verse. Thomas turned his head slightly, just enough to look at her. Her eyes were fixed on the fire, wide and dark and unreadable. He wanted to say something, anything, but nothing rose. He settled for breath. Morning. The storm had passed. Light filtered through the slats in soft blue streaks. The land smelled clean, fresh earth and wet grass, like something had been washed away. Thomas tried to sit up. His ribs ached like they'd been dragged through gravel, but he was alive. Neha was still beside him, eyes closed. Her head leaned back against the post. Not asleep, just resting in the hush that follows a night like that. He didn't thank her. She didn't ask him to. Outside, the ranch looked the same. But something between them had changed, not mended. Not defined, but something real. A bond forged in blood, rain, and firelight. And neither of them would forget it. The days after the storm passed without hurry. Wind still sang across the fields at dusk, but the sharpness had dulled. Thomas moved slower, his sides stiff where the bullet had kissed his ribs. Neha had stitched the wound clean and wrapped it tight. Now he wore it like an unwanted badge, not of bravery, but of stubbornness. She didn't leave. That was something. She split logs behind the barn without being asked. She cooked cornmeal cakes in the mornings, humming sometimes under her breath, her voice as soft as worn fabric. She began braiding her hair again, tight, careful lines down her back. He noticed she did it only when she felt safe. They shared space, meals, firelight, the quiet hours. Before dawn when the world felt more honest. But living with someone was not the same as knowing them. And knowing someone, really knowing them, came with its own kind of danger. The silence between them shifted shape each day, sometimes warm, sometimes brittle. Sometimes it hovered like a third presence, waiting for one of them to say something that couldn't be taken back. Thomas watched her more than he should have. Not in the way men watch women. More like a man trying to make sense of smoke, something fleeting, impossible to hold. He'd find himself staring when she hung the wet shawl on the line, or when she blew across her coffee before sipping. Once, from the porch, he watched her hum an old song by the barn, swaying slightly as she worked. Dust caught in the air like golden thread. "You remind me of someone," he said. The words surprised even him. She turned, the song dying on her lips. "So do you." They let the words hang there. Neither tried to pull them closer. One afternoon, while bringing kindling inside, he found a sheet of paper by her cot. Charcoal. Drawings, crude but careful. The barn, outlined against the hills, the shawl, blowing on the line, his rocking chair. Her own braid, sketched from memory. There was tenderness in the lines, as if she were cataloging the things that made her feel real again. He didn't speak to her about it, just left the paper where he found it. But it stayed with him, how long it had taken him to see her as more than a wound. She wasn't healed. Neither was he. But there was a girl there. A life that had once laughed somewhere, probably danced. Not just a shadow that slept by the hearth. Then came the knock. A neighbor, Samuel Cray, thick with tobacco and nosy politeness, rode up with a sack of seed and too many questions. Said he was checking in after the gunshots folks claimed they'd heard in the last storm. Thomas stepped out onto the porch to meet him, body stiff, voice short. Cray's eyes drifted to the window, where Neha was visible by the kitchen counter. "Rinsing a pot, that your girl?" he asked. Thomas hesitated. "Just a blink, but that was enough. She's kin," he said. "Cousin from out east." Cray raised his brows. "Funny, don't look the part." Thomas forced a nod. "Worlds. A mess. Blood don't always read proper." Cray gave a smirk, spat near the porch steps, and said he'd be on his way. But the pause had already done its damage. Inside, Neha was still washing the same pot. Her hands didn't stop, but her shoulders had gone still. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. That night, she didn't join him for supper. Left her. Food untouched. The shawl remained folded at the edge of her cot. He lit the lamp early and sat on the porch, the cold coming in behind his ribs. The night pressed close, heavy and quiet. He wanted to explain that safety sometimes wore the face of cowardice, that the wrong truth at the wrong time could get a body hung from their own porch. But he didn't speak. And she didn't ask. Him to trust, once opened, had a way of retreating like winter, slow, reluctant, unfinished. It didn't slam shut. It creaked, and that sound was harder to live with than silence. The cold deepened its grip. Wind hissed through the cracks in the cabin walls like a voice too tired to shout. Snow layered the porch steps, drifted high against the barn, and turned the yard into a sheet of dull silver. Wood split harder now. Even the fire seemed slower to catch. Inside, the hearth stayed lit from morning to night. Neha moved quieter than before, but her presence was steadier, like the creak of the rocking chair, or the ticking sound the stovepipe made as it cooled. She slept on the cot still, wrapped in the shawl. But her footsteps had rhythm now, confidence. Her braid was always neat, always long. She walked like she belonged, and in many ways she did. Then the boy went missing. A farmhand son from 2 hills over, barely 11. Last seen near the pine stretch where Thomas's land met the government trail. They said he'd followed his dog into the woods and never came back. 3 days passed before the first riders came. 5 men, all on horseback, with frost crusting their beards and suspicion in their eyes. Thomas saw them coming long before they arrived. He found Neha in the kitchen and said only, "Go to the cellar. Don't ask." She didn't argue. But her jaw clenched as she opened the trapdoor and slipped down into the dark. The men came loud, kicking snow off their boots, rifles slung carelessly but ready. They looked around, asked questions too casual to be honest. One of them peered toward the kitchen door, nose twitching like he could smell what Thomas wasn't. Saying, "You see anything strange?" they asked. Thomas shrugged. "Strange finds its way here same as anywhere." "Haven't seen a boy, if that's what you mean." Another one leaned against the table, eyes drifting to the corner where Neha's bowl usually sat. It wasn't there now. "They stayed too long, spoke too slow." But eventually they left, hooves crunching snow like bones under boot. When the sound of horses faded, Thomas lifted the cellar door. Neha didn't climb out right away. When she did, she didn't look at him. She brushed dust from her skirt, stood in the center of the room, and stared at the door. Then she turned, not gentle, not loud, but with a sharpness he hadn't seen before. "I lived," she said, voice calm. "And you hide me like I'm still dying." He looked at her, opened his mouth, closed it again. "I know what they think of me," she said, softer now. "But I'm not a thing to bury just because someone knocks." He didn't argue. What could he say? That fear makes cowards even. Of men who've bled? That his hands still shook when he thought of the porch stained red? Instead, that night, he sat by the fire longer than usual, a bottle untouched beside him. When Neha came from the back room, she didn't speak. Just watched. Him. His hands were curled around something small and creased, paper worn soft by years of denial. An envelope, unopened. "My wife wrote this before she died," he said without turning. "Told me not to read it until I was ready to hear the things I'd never said." Neha moved closer. "I kept it," he said. "But I never wanted the words to change the memory." He looked at her finally, eyes tired. "I'm not proud of how I've lived since she left. And I don't know what I'm doing now, but hiding you today? That wasn't to protect me." He held out the letter. Neha took it, sat beside him on the floor, opened the stove door and fed it to the fire. The flame caught fast. The paper curled in seconds, words evaporating into warmth neither of them could read. They sat shoulder to shoulder after that. The room was quiet except for the fire and the snow melting off the windowsills. Neha untied her braid, smoothed it once. Then, slowly, she laid it across his open palm, the same way someone lays a ribbon on an altar. A gift, not a question. He didn't speak, just closed his fingers around it. Later, he slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat, close to the place his heart still beat. No kisses passed between them. No hand sought more than what was given, but the fire burned brighter that night. And something between them, fragile, unspoken, took root in the thawing silence, asked ChatGPT. By the time the snow melted and the creek began to hum again, something in Thomas had already shifted. The sky softened. Grass peeked through the thawing dirt. Birds returned, shy and quiet at first, as though unsure whether they were welcome. After such a hard winter, word came on the wind, not through letters or riders, but from the hush of travelers and the silence between conversations. The raiders who once hunted Neha hadn't gone far. They were circling again, burning out small camps, sharpening fear where peace had only just begun to bloom. This time, Thomas didn't wait for them to come. He saddled the mare at dawn, hands steady as he cinched the straps. He packed the rifle, a flask, a pouch of dried meat, and a map rolled tight with twine. On the table, he left a note in uneven block letters. If I don't return, the house is yours. The deed's in the cedar chest. Rifles loaded, locked the door. He didn't wake her. She was asleep near the hearth, the shawl drawn over her shoulders. Her braid folded beneath her chin like a question not yet answered. He paused once at the door. Looked at her in the dim glow of a dying fire. Then he rode. The ride wasn't noble. He wasn't chasing glory or vengeance. He carried no speeches in his throat, only warnings to outposts, to farmers with Apache kin, to families too old to flee quickly. He told them what they needed to know, then rode on. The days blurred into wind, dust, blood-red sunsets. He didn't shoot unless shot at. He didn't speak unless necessary. Somewhere along the trail, a man took a swing at him with a broken pistol. Thomas ducked too slow. Woke up half buried under his own coat, blood crusted along his temple, and a tooth loose in his mouth. But he got back on the horse when he finally crested the last hill and saw the cabin again. Dusk was already falling. The barn stood as it always had. Smoke curled lazy from the chimney, and there she was, on the porch, rocking slowly in the chair. Miriam once claimed every evening before supper. Neha had a tin cup in her hands. Her braid lay neat and dark over one shoulder, gleaming faintly in the low amber light. She wasn't watching the horizon. She was waiting. Thomas dismounted, boots crunching softly over the gravel path. His shoulder ached. A bandage peeked from beneath his collar. But the pain didn't matter now. She looked up at him. Her smile was small, but it held. You came back, she said. He nodded once. You never left. The words weren't poetry. They weren't even the kind meant to last. But they were true, and that was more than either of them had lived. On in a long time, he sat on the steps beside her, groaning slightly as his bruised ribs folded under his coat. She passed him the cup without a word. Warm coffee. A little bitter, perfect. They sat like that for a long while. Not touching. Not talking, but something in the stillness between them had changed. The sun fell behind the ridge. The sky bruised purple, then slipped into soft gray. Clouds moved in. From the south, slow and heavy, not angry this time. Just full. And then rain. Not thunder, not wind, just rain. Soft, even drops falling onto the porch roof and the dirt road, turning dust into scent. It didn't chase them inside. It didn't demand fear. Thomas leaned back against the post. Closed his eyes. The sound reminded him of nights long ago, of sleeping beside a woman who braided her hair in the dark, and of mornings where coffee cups were left out for someone to find. He opened his eyes and turned toward Neha. She was looking out at the rain, quiet as breath. He didn't say anything. Neither did she, but when her hand slid lightly onto his, resting there, not gripping, not asking, he didn't pull away, and the porch, the rain, the quiet between them, it all felt like home.